The effects of World War I are not lost to us at Liber-tea. The Great War was extremely destructive and traumatic to the world. The most tragic thing about this war was its harmful effect on societies across the globe. Many described it as the war to end all war, but in reality, it did nothing of the sort. The hardships it created and its aftermath sowed the seeds of the Second World War, which was deadlier than the Great War. As General William Sherman famously said, "War is hell." When General Sherman said this, he was not just referring to the Civil War, he described war in general. World War I brought General Sherman's words to life. Against this backdrop, join us here at Liber-tea to explore the brutal realities of the people who lived through the Great War. In 1914, when the Great War broke out, everyone thought it would only last a few months. Both the leaders and civilians of the belligerent nations were unprepared for the duration and brutality of the war. The Industrial Revolution had industrialized everything, including the war machine. Armies used new technology, including tanks, submarines, airplanes, flamethrowers, machine guns, and poison gas. However, despite the threats that these new weapons brought, both civilians and soldiers yearned for battle. It will be over by Christmas, they said. The Great War was the first modern, total war, which had tremendous consequences on both soldiers and civilians. For example, it required women to play their roles at home while engaging in various activities to enhance their country's war efforts. The war claimed the lives of millions of civilians, most of whom were just collateral damage. According to the records, the Great War claimed the lives of more than 5 million civilians and 9 million soldiers. Additionally, it left more than 7 million individuals permanently disabled. While previous wars generally restricted violence to battlefields, the Great War ushered in a new period of lethal military tech. World War I eroded the distinction between civilian and military targets. Germany, for instance, used unrestricted submarine warfare to sink civilian ships. It also used zeppelins to drop bombs on the streets of British cities. The war also ignited massacres and the expulsion of certain ethnic people from their homelands. The best example is the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire. It is a truism to state that the Great War had more far-reaching consequences than any other war. Politically, it caused the downfall of 4 monarchies: Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Turkey. In Russia, it aided the Bolsheviks in usurping power from the Romanovs. The Russian Revolution was a bloody affair that claimed the lives of millions of civilians, including members of the royal family. Life during the First World War was short, nasty, and brutal. Civilians and soldiers alike lived in constant fear of violent death. From an economic standpoint, World War I interrupted the European economy, which allowed the U.S. to become the world's industrial power and leading creator. While this caused the U.S. economy to grow, people in Europe languished in poverty due to the disruption of supply chains by the naval blockades. Many Europeans died of starvation and epidemics during this period. World War I brought numerous social consequences, including the massacre of Armenians in Turkey. As the war raged across Europe, the influenza pandemic also raged. It claimed over 25 million lives in Europe. The extreme violence of World War I battlefields was often brought to civilians. For example, following the invasion of northern France and Belgium, German soldiers constantly attacked civilians. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire used the war as an opportunity to engage in genocide against the Armenian people. The massacres finally ended in the 1920s, having claimed the lives of more than 1.5 million Armenians. To this day, the Turkish government refuses to acknowledge the genocide. Most of the war on the Western Front occurred in trenches. The trenches were a labyrinth of disease, decaying corpses, rats, and an omnipresent threat of violent death. Rats often came up to feast on the plentiful corpses of soldiers. They multiplied exceedingly. In most wars, armies constantly moved. The Great War was different. World War I armies stayed in the same positions for months. In the trenches, they festered in cold, hunger, disease, and the horror of going above the trenches to face a barrage of enemy bullets and artillery on no man's land. Thus, the life of a World War I soldier was characterized by hunger, disease, and fear. In 1915, the German army shocked Allied forces when it fired more than 156 tons of lethal chlorine gas at French soldiers in Belgium. At the beginning of World War I, the Germans were actively involved in experimenting with chemical weapons. In another instance, the Germans used mustard gas, killing thousands of Allied troops. The U.S., which joined the war in 1917, also used chemical weapons. Apart from using poisonous gas to murder Allied soldiers, the Germans used it to kill millions of people in extermination camps. On the Eastern Front, Austria launched 3 massive attacks on the Russians. All 3 attacks failed miserably. Over 100,000 Austrian soldiers froze to death during the attacks. In response to the offenses by the Austrian army, Russia resulted in a scorched earth policy. They forced Polish people to burn their crops and flee their homes. This created a refugee crisis. The civilians fleeing the war passed through the freezing mountains of Albania and Montenegro. Over 200,000 civilians died during this escape. The civilian populations of all belligerent nations were constantly stalked with anger. Food distribution and agriculture were severely damaged by the blockades employed by navies to reduce food imports. The war took horses and men from farm work and placed them on battlefields. Reduced agriculture output caused food shortages, which drove the food price up. Some governments responded by applying price controls on staple foods. Across Europe, women and children were a common sight in food queues. The Germans introduced numerous controls on the sale of food and its production. These controls only worsened the situation and the effects of the Royal Navy's blockade. The government resulted in the production of substitute foodstuffs from various unappetizing ingredients. However, the nutritional value of the food substitutes was negligible. As such, German people became malnourished from 1916 onwards. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare was designed to subject the Allied powers to a food crisis. Allied powers were heavily reliant on imported grains. This made submarine attacks a serious threat to their food security. While the British, for instance, tried to increase their food production levels, the best they could do was to institute rationing. While the war had numerous negative effects on the population, it allowed women to get their first taste of financial and personal independence. Since all the men were on battlefields, women staffed offices, factories, and farms. Additionally, during this time, many women's rights groups lobbied for suffrage in various countries between 1917 and 1920. It also gave rise to numerous worker organizations that began to fight for the rights of working-class people across the globe. However, the aftermath of the war put in place the factors that led to World War II. Understanding the impact of the Great War on the lives of people who lived during that period is of great importance. The Great War played an important role in shaping the world we live in today. In trying to understand why the Great War happened, one realizes that a few self-interested individuals in government who wanted to advance their agendas caused the war. The people who suffered the most atrocities during the war were ordinary citizens. Additionally, it shifted the global center of power from Europe to the U.S. The war left millions of Europeans impoverished, destitute, and suffering. War destroys societies immensely. It destroys families and communities and disrupts the growth of economic and social fabrics of nations. The Great War achieved all this and much more. It left many European countries wallowing in economic crisis and caused widespread chaos. Unfortunately, the consequences of the Great War were not instructive to the belligerent nations. 2 decades later, they embarked yet again on another bloodier military campaign that included the use of atomic weapons. Thank you for listening in. Show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Liber-tea for more mind-blowing historical discussions. Additionally, you can share your opinion on the matter by commenting on the comments section.